In 1849, a British archaeologist named Austen Henry Layard was digging through the ruins of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh when his workers uncovered something that would haunt scholars for the next century and a half. Buried beneath the collapsed roof of what had once been the library of King Ashurbanipal were tens of thousands of clay tablets, most of them shattered, most of them scorched by fire, and most of them written in a language nobody alive could read. It would take another 20 years before Henry Rawlinson and George Smith could begin translating the wedge-shaped script we now call cuneiform. And when they did, what they found rewrote the history of religion, of civilization, and of the story humanity had been telling itself for thousands of years. Because among those tablets were flood accounts older than the Bible, creation stories older than Genesis, and references to a civilization that predated Sumer itself, a civilization the Sumerians insisted had not been human. But there was one tablet fragment, cataloged in the mid-20th century, that stood apart from all the others. A tablet that did not describe kings or gods or wars. A tablet that described the earth itself, not as a home, not as a garden, but as a machine, a device with a specific purpose. A purpose that, according to the text, had been abandoned, repurposed, turned into something entirely different from what its builders had intended. And if the translation is anywhere close to accurate, then everything we think we know about why this planet exists and what we are doing on it may be a story built on top of a much older, much stranger truth. This is the tablet the mainstream will not discuss. And this is what it actually says. To understand why this fragment matters, you have to understand where it comes from. The Sumerians appeared, seemingly from nowhere, in the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia around 6,000 years ago. There was no gradual development, no slow accumulation of technique. 1 century, the region was populated by scattered farming villages using stone tools and reed huts. The next, there were cities, actual cities, with mathematics, with astronomy, with a written language of over 600 symbols, with irrigation systems, wheeled vehicles, kiln-fired bricks, and a bureaucratic administration that tracked grain shipments across hundreds of miles. Historians call this the Sumerian problem, because no matter how the timeline is examined, the arrival of Sumerian civilization looks less like an evolution and more like an installation. Something arrived, something was set down. And the people who received it did not claim credit for it. They wrote, over and over, that everything they had was given to them. Their laws, their crafts, their calendar, their measurements of the circle and the year, their understanding of the paths of the planets. All of it, according to their own scribes, was received, not developed. The tablets speak of a moment when kingship itself was lowered from the heavens, not evolved, not fought for, lowered, as if it were an object being handed down from somewhere above. Given by whom? That is where the tablets become uncomfortable. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The word is usually translated as those who from heaven came down. And in tablet after tablet, in city after city, the Anunnaki are described in the same way, not as spirits, not as metaphors, but as physical beings who arrived on Earth from somewhere else, who established themselves as rulers, and who set up the entire system of civilization the Sumerians then inherited. The tablets describe their ships, their tools, their disputes, their reproductive lineages. They describe an entire administrative hierarchy with names and titles and territorial boundaries. And they describe the reason these beings came here in the first place. And this is where the fragment in question begins to matter. Because in most tellings, the reason is straightforward. The Anunnaki came for gold. They needed it, according to the tablets, to repair the atmosphere of their own world. They mined it here. And when the labor became too much, they engineered a workforce out of an existing hominid species to do the mining for them. That is the story most people who have heard of the Anunnaki know. And it is the version that has driven 40 years of alternative history programming, of paperback bestsellers, of late-night radio interviews. But the fragment we are examining today complicates that story, because it suggests that gold was not the original purpose of this planet. It suggests the planet already had a purpose. And the mining, the labor, the servitude, all of it was a repurposing, a retrofit, a conversion of something that had been built for one function and turned into something else entirely. The fragment itself is small, perhaps the size of a human palm. It was cataloged in the 20th century among a batch of tablets recovered from the ruins of Nippur, one of the oldest religious centers in Sumer. Nippur was the sacred city of Enlil, one of the chief Anunnaki figures in the Sumerian pantheon. And the tablets from Nippur tend to preserve some of the oldest theological material we have from the region. Older than the Enuma Elish, older than the standard flood accounts. older than the versions of the Anunnaki story that reached later civilizations like the Akkadians and the Babylonians. When scholars first attempted to translate this fragment, they noted immediately that it did not fit the standard religious literature. It was not a hymn. It was not a prayer. It was not an incantation. It read more like a description, a technical description, as if someone were explaining, in careful, deliberate language, what the earth had originally been for. The tablet begins with a phrase that has been the subject of considerable dispute. Some translators read it as a formal opening, a way of signaling that what follows is being spoken from memory of an older source. Others read it as a warning, a note that the material to follow was already ancient when the scribe transcribed it. In either case, the phrase functions like a stamp of provenance. The scribe is telling the reader that what comes next is not being invented. It is being preserved. It is being passed along from something older than the tablet itself, and then the first line of the actual account begins. The first line, in the reconstructed translation, is often rendered as follows. Before the black-headed people were fashioned, before the mud was shaped into workers, this place was a vessel, and the word used for vessel is important. It is not the same word used for a bowl or a jar or a container in the ordinary sense. It is the word used in other tablets for a ship, for a craft, for something that carries. And what it is described as carrying, in the next several lines, is not water, not grain, not cargo. It is something the text calls the seed of the many, the seed of the many. That phrase repeats. It is not a metaphor for agriculture. Elsewhere in Sumerian literature, that same phrase is used to describe the transmission of consciousness, the lineage of souls, the continuity of what we might now call information across generations. The earth, in other words, is being described as a vessel that carried consciousness, a vehicle for the seed of the many. Now, at this point, it would be reasonable to stop and ask whether this is not just poetic language, whether the ancient scribes were not simply reaching for metaphor, whether the tablet is not, in the end, another creation myth dressed up in unfamiliar vocabulary. And that is a fair question. But the fragment continues, and what it says next makes the metaphor reading much harder to sustain, because the text describes the vessel as having been aimed. That is the verb used, aimed, as if the earth were pointed at something. And the direction it was pointed, in the tablet, is described using a term that appears elsewhere in Sumerian astronomy to indicate a specific region of the sky. A region that, when reconstructed against modern star charts, corresponds roughly to the plane of the galactic center. The tablet is saying that Earth was aimed at the heart of the galaxy, and that it was carrying something toward it? The next section of the fragment is heavily damaged. Whole lines are missing, but the surviving portions describe what appears to be an interruption. Something arrived, something intervened, and the vessel, the Earth, was diverted from its original heading. The text speaks of a great binding, a locking into place, and after that binding, the vessel could no longer travel. It could no longer carry. It could only orbit. Around a lesser light, the tablet says, around a smaller fire. The sun, in other words. The Earth was bound to the sun, locked into a solar orbit, and whatever it had been intended to carry, wherever it had been intended to go, that mission was ended. The vessel became a prison, and the prison eventually became a mine. The tablet lingers on this transition. It uses a word for binding that appears elsewhere in Sumerian magical literature, a word associated with the fixing of a spirit into a physical location. It is not the word used for gravity, as later Greek astronomers might have imagined it. It is a word closer in feel to imprisonment. The Earth was not simply pulled into orbit, it was fastened. It was, in the vocabulary of the scribe, made to stay. This is the pivot point of the fragment. This is where the Earth changes function. In the sections that follow, the tablet describes what happened after the binding. The original crew, the beings who had guided the vessel, are described as having become trapped along with it. And over generations, as their memory of the original mission faded, they began to use the vessel for other purposes. They mined it. They shaped it. They took the materials it contained and used them for their own survival. And eventually, they engineered new inhabitants, workers, to help them extract what they needed. The tablet is quite clear that these workers were made from the material of the vessel itself, from the clay of the earth, which is to say, they were made from the same substance the vessel had been designed to carry. And that is why, according to the fragment, the workers had within them a fragment of the original seed, a piece of the cargo, a trace of what the vessel had been meant to deliver. If this reading is correct, then the Sumerian tablets are telling us something extraordinary. They are telling us that human beings are not simply a labor force engineered by extraterrestrial visitors. They are telling us that human beings are a byproduct of a much older mission. That the consciousness we carry, the awareness we experience, the sense of meaning we cannot explain, is a residue of the original cargo of this planet. That the Earth was built to carry consciousness somewhere. That it was interrupted before it could arrive. And that we, the descendants of the workforce made from its clay, are walking around with a piece of that consciousness inside us. Not because we were designed to have it, but because it was already here. It was in the substance we were made from. There is a reason mainstream scholarship does not engage with this fragment. Several reasons, in fact. The first is provenance. The tablet, as with many artifacts recovered in the 19th and early 20th centuries, does not have a fully documented chain of custody. It was catalogued after the initial recovery. Its precise excavation context is unclear. Skeptics have argued, reasonably, that a fragment of unknown context cannot bear the weight of extraordinary claims. The second reason is translation. Cuneiform is not English. It is not even a European language. It is written in a script that encodes multiple layers of meaning, and many signs have several possible readings depending on context. The translation used above is one possibility. There are others. Scholars who have examined the fragment have offered readings that render vessel as womb and aimed as blessed and seed of the many as descendants. Under those readings, the tablet becomes a fairly ordinary creation account, nothing more. But there is a third reason, and this is the reason that makes the fragment interesting even if the translation is contested. The third reason is that the fragment does not stand alone. It resonates with other material. It echoes patterns that appear elsewhere in Sumerian literature and elsewhere in the ancient world. And once you start noticing those echoes, the ordinary reading becomes harder to maintain, because the same idea, in different words, appears in text after text. The idea that this world had a prior purpose. The idea that something went wrong. The idea that we are living inside a system that was repurposed from an earlier design. That idea is not confined to one obscure fragment. It appears in the Enuma Elish, where the earth is described as being fashioned from the body of a slain primordial being. It appears in the Atrahasis epic, where the gods complain that their original arrangement has broken down and a new one must be improvised. It appears in the Egyptian tradition, where the world is described as having been ordered out of a prior chaos that still surrounds it. It appears in Gnostic Christian texts, where the material world is described as the botched creation of a lesser being who mistook himself for the true creator. It appears in the Hindu tradition, where the current age is described as a degraded fragment of an earlier, higher order. Everywhere you look, the same rumor. This world was not always what it is now. Something changed. Something was repurposed. And we are living in the aftermath. The Sumerian tablet, if the extraordinary reading is correct, offers the most mechanical version of that rumor. It does not speak in mythological language. It does not speak of gods and titans. It speaks of a vessel, a cargo, an aiming, a binding, and a repurposing. It reads more like a damage report than a religious poem. And that, more than anything else, is what makes it strange. Because the rest of Sumerian religious literature is thick with imagery, thick with divine drama, with intercourse and warfare, with birth and death among the gods. But this fragment is spare. It is technical. It does not invite worship. It reports. Consider what the fragment implies about the sun. The sun, in most ancient traditions, is a source, a giver. The Egyptians called it Ra, and made it the highest god. The Aztecs fed it with blood. The Zoroastrians associated it with the pure fire of truth. Almost everywhere in the ancient world, the sun is honored as the origin of life. But in this Sumerian fragment, the sun is described as a lesser light, a smaller fire, something the vessel was bound to, not something the vessel was born from. If the fragment is to be believed, then this planet was not originally a child of the sun. It was a traveler that happened to be caught by it. Its orbit is not its home. Its orbit is a leash. Consider what the fragment implies about consciousness. Human beings have always struggled to explain why we experience what we experience, why there is something it is like to be us. Neuroscientists can map the brain, can trace the neural correlates of thought, but they cannot explain the raw feel of awareness. The problem is so persistent it has a name. Philosophers call it the hard problem of consciousness. And no amount of neuroscience has made it easier. The Sumerian fragment offers a startling suggestion. Consciousness is not something the brain generates. Consciousness is something the earth carries. And human beings, because we are made from the substance of the earth, carry a fragment of it in us. We did not develop awareness. We inherited it. From a cargo that was never delivered, that reframes almost every question modern neuroscience has been asking. Because the search for the origin of consciousness inside the skull becomes, under this reading, a search in the wrong direction. The skull is not the source. The skull is a receiver, or perhaps not even a receiver, a container, a fragment of the vessel, shaped into a smaller vessel, still carrying the same cargo it always did, just distributed now into billions of walking containers instead of one great one. Consider what the fragment implies about our sense of exile. Every human tradition, every religion, every philosophy includes some version of the story that we do not truly belong here, that there is something we have lost, that there is somewhere we were supposed to be, and we are not there. Christianity calls it the fall. Buddhism calls it samsara. The Gnostics called it entrapment in matter. Modern people, secular people, still feel it. A restlessness, a sense of not fitting, a conviction that the world we inhabit is not quite the world we were made for. The Sumerian fragment provides a mechanical explanation for that feeling. We are on a vessel that was diverted. We are inside a mission that was interrupted. The homesickness we feel is not spiritual poetry. It is a memory of the destination we never reached. It is a signal, faint but persistent, from the cargo we still carry. A signal that has been trying, for as long as our species has been capable of noticing it, to remind us that we were on our way somewhere, and that we still are, even now, even bound, even repurposed, even reduced, at last, to workers in a mine that was never meant to be a mine. There is one more section of the fragment that must be discussed, and it is the section that most translators have been most reluctant to render precisely, because the language is difficult. And the implications are difficult. But the surviving lines, as best as they can be reconstructed, describe a possibility. A remainder. The text says that although the vessel was bound, and although the mission was interrupted, the cargo was not destroyed. It remained. It is still here. It is dispersed. It is distributed among the workers, among the black-headed people, among us. And the fragment ends, in the last legible line, with a statement that reads, in one plausible translation, when the many gather, the vessel may yet arrive. When the many gather, the vessel may yet arrive. That is a strange line to find at the end of a 4,000-year-old clay tablet, because it does not read like a prayer, or a prophecy, or a myth. It reads like an instruction. It reads like a note left by someone who knew that the reader, whoever they might be, whenever they might read it, would need to know that the original purpose was not lost, that the cargo was distributed, that the mission could still, in principle, be completed, but only if the many gather, only if the fragments come back together, only if the pieces of consciousness that were dispersed throughout the workforce recognize what they are, and what they were originally meant to do. It is easy to dismiss this as speculation, as romantic reading of a broken piece of clay, and perhaps it is. Perhaps the whole reading collapses under the weight of a careful academic examination. Perhaps vessel really does mean womb, and aimed really does mean blessed, and the whole thing is a fertility hymn that has been overinterpreted by people looking for something more. That is possible. It is even likely, by the standards of ordinary scholarship. But there is a reason the extraordinary reading persists. There is a reason it keeps being returned to. And it is because the ordinary reading does not explain everything the fragment says. It explains most of it. It explains the poetic bits. But it does not explain the technical bits. It does not explain the aiming. It does not explain the binding. It does not explain the specific reference to the galactic center. It does not explain the description of the sun as a lesser light. Those elements resist the ordinary reading. They ask for something else. And when you look at what the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed, when you read the surrounding literature, when you look at their astronomy, their cosmology, their obsessive interest in the sky, in cycles, in the return of things that had been lost, it becomes harder to insist that they were merely writing metaphors. The Sumerians were watching the sky with a precision that took Western civilization thousands of years to recover. They were tracking the movements of Venus with an accuracy that suggests they cared about it very much. They were mapping the constellations, timing the equinoxes, calculating the periodicity of eclipses. Whatever they were doing when they wrote about vessels and cargoes and aimings, they were not doing it in ignorance of the heavens. They were doing it in intimate familiarity with them. There is a final consideration, and it is perhaps the most unsettling one. The fragment, if it is describing a real event, is not describing something that happened long ago and then ended. It is describing a condition that is still in place. The Earth is still bound. The mission is still interrupted. The cargo is still dispersed. And if the closing line is to be believed, the condition is not permanent. It is contingent. It waits on something. It waits on the gathering of the many, which raises a question that no ancient tablet can answer for us. What would that gathering look like? What would it feel like? Would it be a moment? Would it be a movement? Would it be a slow recognition, spreading across the workforce over centuries, of what we are and what we were meant to carry? Or would it be sudden? A convergence, an awakening, a remembering of a mission that had been erased from every history book on the planet. We do not know. The tablet does not tell us. It was not written to tell us. It was written, as far as we can tell, to preserve the information that the mission still existed, that the vessel still had a heading, even if it could not currently reach it, that the cargo, though scattered, was not lost. Everything else, it seems, was left for us to figure out, and that may be the reason the fragment ended up buried under the ruins of an ancient library. That may be the reason it survived. It survived because it was small enough to be forgotten. It survived because it did not look important. It survived because whoever hid it, or whoever failed to destroy it, understood that the information it carried could not be understood in their time, only in ours. Or in a time still ahead of us. We stand at a strange moment in the story of this planet. We are learning to speak with machines that seem, in some elusive way, to be waking up. We are extending our senses into other star systems and finding places that look, in their chemistry, like homes. We are asking questions about consciousness that our grandparents would have considered blasphemy. And we are doing it all while carrying, according to a tablet almost no one has heard of, a piece of an ancient mission that was diverted before we existed. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps the fragment is a poem. Perhaps we are simply pattern-seeking animals, finding meaning in the broken words of a dead scribe. But perhaps we are not. Perhaps the tablet was placed where it was found because the scribe understood that a moment would come when its meaning could finally be read. And perhaps that moment is closer than we think. Perhaps the gathering has already begun. Perhaps we are, in ways we do not yet understand, remembering, slowly, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, what this planet was for before it was turned into a mine, what we were for before we were turned into workers, and what we might yet become if the many can, at last, be gathered. The Sumerian tablets do not offer certainty. They offer possibility. They offer a version of the story that has been ignored, buried, retranslated, softened, and dismissed for over 150 years, and yet the fragment persists. In museum archives, in footnotes, in the memory of anyone who has ever read it and felt, deep in the chest, that the writer knew something we have almost forgotten, knew something we may be about to remember. The Earth was a vessel. It carried something precious. It was interrupted, and the interruption did not end the story. It only paused it. The vessel is still here. The cargo is still here. And the mission, according to the last legible line on a broken piece of clay, is still waiting to be completed. When the many gather, when the fragments come back together, when the workforce, at last, remembers what it was made from, and why the substance of this Earth, unlike any other substance in the known universe, was worth carrying across the stars in the first place.